Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our online event, Queering Europe, Nationalism and Sexuality, an event that's hosted by the LSE European Institute and the LSE Department of Gender Studies. A big thank you to both those two departments, the European Institute and the Department of Gender Studies, as well as the LSE Events, Public Events Program for hosting all of us tonight. My name is Jacob Breslow. I'm Assistant Professor of Sexuality and Gender at the LSE Department of Gender Studies, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this event today and to be welcoming our amazing panel of speakers. Before we get to the speakers, I have a few housekeeping announcements. For those of you who are joining us on Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Eurocentrism. I think we were going to go for LSE Beyond Eurocentrism, but that was slightly too long of a hashtag for Twitter. But with that sentiment, of course, in mind. The event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. So tonight, our event is going to consist of presentations from our speakers, followed by some further questions and a public Q&A with the audience. And when we come to the Q&A portion of our event, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions are going to be sent to me. I'll read through them and then present them to our speakers. So let us know your name and your affiliation if you have one when you ask a question. Tonight's event is going to explore the seemingly paradoxical relationship between sexuality and Europeanness. Challenging the binary of tolerant West and intolerant others, the event will discuss how both homophobia and homonationalism are intertwined with nationalist projects across the continent. It's now been about 20 years since Poir and Rai's Monster Terrorist Fag was published with social text, 14 years since Terrorist Assemblages was published, and a decade since Fatima Tayeb's European Others was published with Minnesota Press. And while that analysis, that sexuality and so-called progressive sexual politics is connected to necropolitical, Islamophobic, and anti-Arab projects of warfare and Orientalist subjectification, we still see across the continent and on this very campus the mobilization of an institutional voice that works to simultaneously claim itself as progressive through its alleged sexual politics and to threaten to take legal action against students exercising their legal right to protest for holding a rally in support of Palestine, for example, in just the last couple of days. Scholars have argued, and perhaps we can discuss this evening, that these two configurations of contemporary politics, the claim of sexual progressiveness on one hand, and the criminalization of acts of solidarity for Palestinians under occupation on the other, actually do go hand in hand. And this conjuncture is part of how the political is structured in our contemporary times. This conjuncture sets the backdrop against which tonight's speakers will be thinking through the convergence of Eurocentrism, nationalism, and sexuality. So with that prompt, let me introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be speaking for you tonight. Our first speaker is Abeera Khan, a fellow in gender and culture at the Department of Sociology at LSE and a PhD candidate at the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS. Her thesis on the fraught politics of becoming, a queer feminist analysis of queer Muslim subjectivation, examines the production of the queer Muslim subject in contemporary Britain. She researches and teaches on the subjects of diaspora, empire, race, and queer feminist studies. She's published with Feminist Review, Lambda Nordica, Religion and Gender, and Cole, a journal for body and gender research. Our second speaker is Richard Mull, professor of political sociology at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL. His research focuses on the interrelationship between nationality and sexuality, with specific reference to Russia and to Poland. And he's the editor of Soviet and Post-Soviet Sexualities with Routledge in 2019, and Queer Migration and Asylum in Europe with UCL Press in 2021. And that text is available open access on the events page of this event. So do definitely take a look at that. Our next speaker will be Alyosxa Tudor, who's senior lecturer in gender studies at SOAS University of London. Alyosha's main research interest lies in analyzing knowledge productions on migrations, diasporas, and borders in relation to critiques of Eurocentrism and to processes of gendering and racialization. Alyosxa has published widely on these topics with Feminist Review, Feminist Theory, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and Gender, Place, and Culture, among others. At the moment, they're working on a new monograph, a very exciting new project called The Endurance of the Mare, a monograph on histories of resilience and sexual and state violence in the eastern borderlands of gender and Europe. And our final speaker for tonight is Fatima Tayeb, professor of ethnicity, race, and migration and women's gender and sexuality studies at Yale University. Her research interests include Black Europe, comparative diaspora studies, queer of color critique, critical Muslim studies, decolonial theory, transnational feminisms, visual culture studies, race and technology, and critical European studies. She is the author of 3 books and numerous articles on the intersections and interactions of race, gender, sexuality, religion, and nation. And her current project explores the intersecting legacies of colonialism, fascism, and socialism in Europe, and the potential of queer people of color alliances in decolonizing the continent. So I'm really delighted and thrilled to be chairing this event tonight with all of these fantastic speakers, and I'm going to hand it over to Abeera to get us going.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for chairing, and thank you to the European Institute and the Department of Gender Studies for organizing this event. So in my brief intervention, I want to reflect on the specter of the intolerant Muslim, specifically as it is configured in Britain, and do a close reading of this figure and what it reveals about sexuality as a mode of racialized governmentality. So in 2016, a government report investigating integration and opportunity in the UK's so-called most isolated and deprived communities released its findings. Led by Dame Louise Casey, the Casey Review's foreword conveys the lukewarm statements of half-hearted government responsibility. Quote, Black boys still not getting jobs, white working class kids on free school meals, still doing badly in our education system, Muslim girls getting good grades at school, but no decent employment opportunities. These remain absolutely vital problems to tackle and get right to improve our society, end quote. Setting aside the peculiar fragmentation of Black from working class from Muslim, I am interested in how this attempt at a statement of government responsibility for class, race, gendered marginalization is instantly repudiated by the evocation of the always reliable scapegoat of the fated culture clash. In the immediate next sentence, we are reminded by Casey of the internal threats posed by wayward cultures and religions to ironclad British values. Quote, but I also find other equally worrying things, including high levels of social and economic isolation in some places, and cultural and religious practices in communities that are not only holding some of our citizens back, but run contrary to British values and sometimes our laws. Time and time again, I found it was women and children who were the targets of these regressive practices, end quote. Casey goes on to share that she debated the contents of the review, given that it would put some communities, particularly Muslim communities, under the spotlight. But as always, the commitment to the bit prevailed, the bit being the assertion that no, really, Britain does care. I want to focus on this concern expressed for women and children, particularly in the ongoing drama between British values and its internal others. Muslim women and children, and I would also add Muslim queers, are often supporting characters in the long contemporary history of moral panics around Islam and Muslims in Britain. The misogynistic and or homophobic and or regressive, if not violent Muslim man is symptomatic of the common sense regarding Muslim deviance in the British imaginary. Anxieties about Muslim culture and demography, their lack of integration, their deviation from British norms of the good life, are conveyed through the language of gender and sexuality to appeal to the already established common sense of Muslims' racialized deviance. So if moral panics around British Muslims fixate on the victimhood of marginal Muslim subjectivities, such as Muslim women, children, and queers, by way of their community's so-called regressive practices, then Muslim men are the naturalized perpetrators of this violence. This antagonism enforces racialization by repeatedly scrutinizing and policing the gendered and sexual norms of Muslim subjects. The racialized gendering of Muslim women and children as victims is thus made possible through the perverse masculinities and sexualities of Muslim men. Moral panics around Muslim men in particular range from the frame of domestic violence and coercion, exemplified, for example, through the debates on forced marriages and FGM, to pedophilia and sex trafficking, most notably seen in the Rochdale, Rotherham, and Bradford grooming gang scandals, to a backwards homophobia, demonstrated in the discourses around the No Outsiders protests in Birmingham. So this reiteration of the sexual and gender menace posed by the Muslim allows for his reification as the embodiment of Muslims' incompatibility with the British public. So if, as Gail Rubin has argued, normative sexuality consolidates normative gender, then deviant sexuality, including the deviant heterosexuality of the Muslim homophobe/misogynist, threatens the normative gender order. Further, if this deviant sexuality is located within specific cultures, then the threat to the normative gender order becomes embodied by said cultures. We see in these moral panics and in the more liberal rhetoric of the Casey Review a resonance with Powellian racist discourse regarding the threat of the immigrant. This peril is not simply immediate, but also an issue of pedigree of the immigrants' putative descendants, namely whether or not their families and their children will reproduce normative citizenship and British values, no matter that the very basis of these norms and values is exclusion. As such, the fixation on incompatibility and integration is not simply an issue regarding the figure of the Muslim homophobe or the repeated repudiation of a backwards Muslim sexuality and culture, but is also an anxiety about social reproduction, particularly whether gendered, sexualized, and racialized Muslim deviance will be dispersed through cultural inheritance. So this antagonism posed by Islam and Muslims in Britain cannot solely be understood under the framework of war on terror securitization regimes and terrorist masculinities. Instead, I want to posit that the racialized gendering of Muslims, men, women, children, and queers alike, is mediated by Europe and specifically Britain's imperial antagonism towards Islam. So in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson argues that the emergence of European civilization and capitalism has always relied on what he calls racialism as its basis of differentiation. Contra classical Marxism, for Robinson, capitalism is a product of racism and nationalism. He identifies 4 particular moments that are foundational to European racialism. First, intra-European racialism, demonstrating the racial ordering of the Greek and Roman empires and their delegation of Europeans outside its empire as barbarians. The second moment is the Islamic domination of the Mediterranean, which gave way to the Dark Ages. According to Robinson, and echoed by Edward Said in Orientalism, this period crystallized Europe's hostility towards its idea of Islam. As such, the development of Europe as an epistemological, ideological, and geographic concept, and as an organizing frame for everyday life within it, is inseparable from the emergence of the Islam versus Europe dualism, and is notable for its racial ideological character. So Robinson goes on to argue that the subsequent 2 moments, the third, the incorporation of African, Asian, and the peoples of the New World into the world system, and fourth, the dialectic of colonialism, plantocratic slavery, and the formations of industrial labor have become naturalized as the starting points for analyses of Western racism. So this neglect of the dialectic of European development, and particularly intra-European racialism, results in the relegation of European racism to a matter of external contact rather than the foundational logic of Europe and modernity itself. So the repercussions of this negligence of intra-European racism are seen in contemporary European social thought, as Fatima Tayeb notes in her book, European Others, whereby both the ideology of race and racialized populations become extraneous to Europe. So Al-Tayeb's analysis reverberates with Robinson's work on the amnesia around race/racialism's foundational role in Europe's self-constitution. So in particular, Al-Tayeb argues that amnesia and racial memory, particularly when it comes to Muslims in Europe, allows for the evasion of the longue durée of the racialization of Islam on the continent. As such, clash of civilization discourses gain legitimacy precisely because the problem of race and its concomitant cultural incompatibility are deduced from the looming specter of a fundamental Muslim otherness, rather than a result of Europe simply continuing its extensive internal tradition of racialism. So in Orientalism, Edward Said makes a very simple statement that I think still rings true today. For Europe, Islam was a lasting trauma. So to return to the question of sexuality, I want to ask, how might our analysis of British moral panics around Muslim deviance transform if we switch the terms of the debate? What if, instead of constantly scrutinizing Europe's internal others, we instead turned our gaze towards Europe's own pathology? What I mean by this is that rather than fixating on sexuality in Europe or even sexuality in Islam within Europe, we instead scrutinize the role of Europe in our understanding of sexuality. To put it differently, how is the emergence and perpetuation of sexuality as a parochial, ethnocentric epistemology structured through Europe's, and particularly Britain's, long contradictory history of positioning an amorphous, homogenized Islam as its other? So to return to the Casey review, its rhetorical figuration of the material hardships faced by the Muslim family unit, the Muslim girl, and the Muslim community perhaps reveals less about some inherent incompatibility of Muslimness with British values, and instead reveals the failure of Britain as a project itself. I think there's something particularly nefarious about how marginal Muslim subjectivities, such as the Muslim women and or the Muslim queer, are worthy of concern solely through the register of domination by their own communities. So in my own work, I am interested in how the interpellation of the queer Muslim in Britain is only ever made possible in dominant ideology through the spectacle of Muslim homophobia. So this call and response structures the conditions of possibility of queer Muslims as recognizable subjects insofar as they can uphold Britain's own imperial hostility towards Islam. As such, how does the constitutive role of Europe and sexuality limit our understanding of the complexities of queer Muslim subject formation? How does it contribute to Europe's project of ontologizing race? So we may learn more about the relationship between the production of the folk devil of the Muslim perpetrator and the production of his presumed queer women and children victims if we switch our gaze towards Europe, and more specifically Britain's own pathology. What can an attentiveness to the legacies of coloniality, Powellian racism, Thatcherite neoliberalism, Thatcherite homophobia, over a decade of austerity, and the ongoing hostile environment reveal to us about subject formation of the queer Muslim? How does the translation of sexuality in Europe through this limited scope of the sexual subject and its concomitant allegiance to the liberal regimes of rights and representation limit an understanding of the relational vulnerabilities produced and perpetuated by Britain as a project? So I want to conclude on the notion of relationality as one possible mode of redress. A relational approach has the capacity to untether the queer Muslim from the grips of cultural domination and homophobia, and instead reposition them as part of a web of interdependent vulnerability and struggle. So when thinking of the Casey Review's reference to the deprivation faced by Black boys, white working class kids, and Muslim girls in Britain, I am reminded of a question posed by Kathy Cohen in Punks, Bull Daggers, and Welfare Queens. Who, we might ask, is truly on the outside of heteronormative power? Maybe most of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abeera, for those amazing and rich provocations and questions. There's a lot that you've already given us as panelists to think through when we turn to the Q&A session. So thank you, thank you. I'm going to turn over to Professor Richard Mull.
Thank you. So today I'd like to start by talking about how homophobic nationalism is being instrumentalized in contemporary Russian politics and how the perceived Westernness of non-normative sexualities and genders is used to legitimize the construction of homosexuality as something that is un-Russian and therefore enables the Russian state to marginalize queer Russians. But then I'd like to move on to discuss the ways that queer Russians themselves respond to this construction of themselves as being un-Russian and how they sort of engage with, respond to this form of homophobic nationalism, and examine whether and to what extent their nationality remains an important part of their sense of self, and if so, why is that? If we can move to the next slide, please. So homophobic nationalism has been a key feature of Russian politics for the best part of a decade now. It was the mass protests against the falsification of the results of the 2011 parliamentary elections which prompted Putin to reaffirm his political legitimacy by protecting traditional Russian values in the face of alien ideas from the West, such as tolerance or support for LGBT rights. Putin signed the so-called gay propaganda law in June 2013, under the terms of which individuals and organizations would be fined for disseminating information about non-traditional sexual orientations among minors, or for promoting the social equivalence of traditional and non-traditional relationships. For Putin, this law serves multiple purposes. First of all, it helps to shore up support among the conservative majority and is part of his ongoing attempt to clamp down on actual and potential political opponents. As support for LGBT rights is constructed as something specifically Western and specifically liberal, Russian liberals and Westernizers are tarred with the LGBT brush, even if they do not specifically support LGBT rights themselves, which, as far as I can see, none of them do. The law thus enables Putin to entrench traditional Russian values in the face of the spread of Western liberal ideas, which he blamed for corrupting Russian youth and for fueling opposition to his rule. And tapping into pre-existing antipathy towards homosexuality, he's also able to use the issue of LGBT rights as a lightning rod to divert attention away from political corruption at home. But to ensure that the anti-queer discourse resonates with Russian society, Putin appeals to Russian nationalism and frames the law as part of a strategy to ensure the survival of the Russian nation. The survival of the physical nation would need a marked increase in the Russian birth rate, and to achieve this goal, according to Putin in a television interview, Russia has to cleanse itself of gay people. To reinforce its specifically Russian identity, the nation needs to define itself against its main other, the West, in particular the United States and Western Europe, and reject their liberal values, including support for LGBT rights. Putin's defense of tradition also chimes with its belief in its national exceptionalism, which can be traced from medieval Moscow's claim to be the Third Rome, through the Slavophiles' insistence on Russia's special path, all the way to Lenin's communist messianism. Since the collapse of the USSR, however, Russia has been searching for a special mission and establishing itself as the defender of traditional values against Western decadence can be seen as a way for Russia to fulfill its historical destiny. While the international outcry against the law was vociferous, Russia could simply provide this Western support for LGBT rights at the expense of Russian national values as proof that he was right all along. The construction of homosexuality as non-traditional and thereby non-Russian, in tandem with Putin's rigorous defense of traditional values as the foundation of Russia's national greatness, successfully legitimized the marginalization of the country's LGBT citizens. And in the 5 years following the introduction of the law, hate crimes against LGBT people in Russia doubled, with murder accounting for more than 80% of the crimes analyzed. As queer Russians are constructed by Russian politicians, the Russian media, and the Russian Orthodox Church as being un-Russian, as a threat to the Russian nation and to Russian values, I was interested to understand how queer Russians themselves responded to these attempts to exclude them from the nation. Was their nationality an important part of their sense of self, and if so, why? Why would you want to be a member of a nation that considers you a threat to its very existence? So to find answers to these questions, I conducted a year of ethnographic research among queer Russian-speaking migrants in Berlin. I chose to focus on queer migrants because issues relating to one's sense of nationality and one's relationship with a nation often come into clearer focus in contexts of displacement. And in general, I argue that queer diaspora is a useful heuristic to think about identity, belonging, and solidarity among sexual and gender minorities in the context of dispersal and transnational networks. If we could move to the next slide, please. So with the exception of one gay man who wanted to assimilate into German culture as quickly as possible, it was apparent from all my other respondents and interview partners that Russianness, particularly with reference to Russian language, culture, and mentality, was a central part of the sense of self of almost my respondents. The ability to speak Russian was particularly stressed as something very important. But part of it was sort of related to sort of communication, the inability to speak German as fluently, but part of it was also about sort of sharing cultural norms. As Olga recalled, it didn't matter if you're from Uzbekistan or Russia, you all had the same 2 TV channels and sang the same songs. So Russian language was a way to sort of create a sense of unity. But it was clear that national identity sort of played a key role in their sense of self-identification, But it was also clear that Russianness was not understood purely as something as an individual sense of self, but rather something that emerged out of interaction with others. Therefore, to sort of engage with sort of others in the context of migration required engaging with sort of other Russians in Berlin. And certainly there's no shortage of Russians in Berlin. There's about 300,000 Russian speakers, although they're largely sort of concentrated in Marzahn, which is a part of the eastern part of the city. But what became clear, sorry, if you could move to the next slide. But what became clear was that the existing Russian diaspora wasn't perceived as being particularly welcoming to sort of queer people, and this was sort of largely explained with reference to the sort of the rigid boundary maintenance, the fact that a lot of the Russians in Berlin sort of remained sort of interacted almost exclusively with other Russian speakers. Therefore, the desire to sort of engage, to speak Russian, to sort of share cultural practices with other Russians was considered sort of more difficult if one sort of spoke of the general diasporic population. And also the sort of some of the diasporic institutions presented a very sort of traditional sort of understanding of what it meant to be Russian. If we could move to the next slide, please. So it was in sort of recognition that sort of being a migrant and LGBT could result in a sense of double discrimination that led to the creation of Kvartira, an association of LGBT Russian speakers and their friends. The aim of Kvartira is to sort of offer psychological support, to provide a space to express your sort of language and your culture, your sexuality, your nationality in a safe space, but also to sort of demonstrate loyalty and solidarity with queers in Russia. But this sort of raised the question as to why an organization such as this would need to be based on a shared sense of national and not just sexual identity. And what became clear from a number of the activists who were who comprised a significant number of Kvartira, was that if they sort of engaged or sort of worked with German sort of organizations in support of LGBT rights, it was very often the case that sort of Western and non-Western hierarchies sort of re-emerged in a supposedly sort of ethno-neutral diaspora. So having a space for specifically sort of Russian language speakers was seen as particularly beneficial for a number of reasons. First of all, as I said, it was a space for LGBT people to express their sort of national identity and their sexuality in the same environment, in the same space. And also it meant that if they were seeking support for certain problems that they were facing, then they didn't need to sort of explain the underlying underpinning social and cultural issues that very often sort of fed into these problems. As sort of Olga explained, individuals and their families can receive support, and they will sort of not need to sort of explain to a sort of a German organization the specific sort of issues relating to attitudes towards gender and sexuality in the context of the Russian community. And Kvartira is also very active in protesting against the situation for LGBT people in Russia and other post-Soviet states. And to cite sort of Rogers Brubaker, it's this shared sexual and sort of ethno-cultural identity that helps it, that facilitates the ability to make claims, to articulate projects, to mobilize energies, and to appeal to loyalties among Russian-speaking queers in Berlin. They sort of engaged in a number of sort of activities such as the Rainbow Flash Mob, whereby individuals simultaneously released rainbow colored balloons in towns and cities across the world. And this was sort of understood as an act of solidarity with sort of LGBT people in Russia and LGBT Russians in Berlin. So what I found was that sort of the Russian queers that I spoke to were able to separate the homophobic nationalism of the Russian state from aspects of Russian national identity, particularly the sort of the linguistic and cultural aspects. And that while they did not adhere to the form of Russian national identity that was being propagated by the Russian state, the Russian media, and the Russian Orthodox Church, nevertheless, their sort of queering of some key Russian key aspects of Russian national identity sort of provided a sense of security, a sense of solidarity, and sort of enabled them to sort of create queer spaces within the Russian diasporic ethnoscape.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing your interview research data with us and for thinking from a queer diasporic space about the ways that we might rethink borders and homophobic nationalisms. That's great. I'm going to hand it over now to Alyosxa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for hosting the panel, and to the European Institute and the Department for Gender Studies for inviting me. My talk is called "Is it Nazism Yet? Claiming Feminism in Right-Wing Times." In this paper, I would like to introduce the term right-wing times to make sense of how feminism and its relationship to sexuality, gender, and nation gets mobilized across several European sites. I'm especially interested in the use of the terms Nazism/fascism, colonialism, and socialism/communism in the debates. 1. Postcolonialism and post-socialism. Similarly to my reflections on the post and post-colonial Europe, and in line with Atanasoki and Bora, I suggest that the prefix post provides odd, contradictory, and productive spatial temporal dimensions, not only in relation to the term it is attached to, see Shohat's theoretization of the post and post-colonial, but also in interrelation between different terms that are prefixed with the syllabus post. See Appiah's question, is the post and postmodernism the post and post-colonial, and various adaptations of the question. Based on Shohat's idea that the prefix post means continuities and ruptures in relation to the term it specifies, and not a simple after, but a non-linear queer temporality that cannot even be fully explained only in temporal dimensions. One could ask too, how the terms which are specified by the prefix post interrelate and how they are put into context to each other through being prefixed in the same way. Is, for example, the socialism in post-socialism, the colonialism in post-colonialism? Certainly, there must be ways to acknowledge that colonialism was and has always been bad, and socialism is at its core what? Good? In theory, a disruption of colonial/racial capitalism. 2, communism. In the Black Lives Matter statements that protesters read out in Bucharest on June 7, 2020, they draw connections between police violence against people of color, anti-Roma violence, and power relations like classism, misogyny, queer and transphobia, and discrimination against sex workers, and underline the need for a transnational frame. Even though the initial moment of the intervention was George Floyd's death and subsequent protests in the US, and therefore had nothing to do with the communist past, the trolls on YouTube accused the protesters of communism. One of them going as far as suggesting they should die like Ceausescu died, also known as being shot by the Romanian military. While the post-colonial moment of the radically intersectional analysis the protesters offer is clear through both the anti-racism of the protest and the racist backlash in the comments, the post-socialist moment is more blurry. We have queer/trans feminist, anti-fascist, anti-racist protesters, and we have a Romanian social media public consisting mainly of fascists and racists accusing the protesters of communism. This is very much in line with UK far-right's politicians Nigel Farage polemics that all migrants, I quote, coming from these communist countries are uncivilized, end of quote. The idea that due to their communist past, Romanians have not learned how to be a proper member of society. As Christian Churchill puts it, Romania is seen as having no politics, no society. Both rhetorics, the one of the Western anti-East European far right and the one of the Romanian far right, are anti-communist, but they ascribe communism to different actors. Western Europe sees all Romanians as tainted by communism. The European East sees itself as having put communism against the wall together with Ceausescu. In this narrative, anti-racist, anti-fascist, queer and trans feminist activists get equated to that past. They have not moved on to the post and post-socialism, which in this grim understanding is the solidification of fascism and far-right regimes. But present-day socialists are not always the ones who oppose racist, misogynist, and queer and transphobic nationalism. The recent attempted ban of gender studies in Romania and the predecessor referendum in 2018 that attempted to change the constitution to make gay marriage constitutionally impossible have both been driven by conservatives, the church, and far right, and backed by the socialists. Aptly, the referendum that failed due to low voter turnout was called Referendum for Romania and advertised with the Romanian national colors. 3. Nazism, fascism. This left-right convergence is a transnational phenomenon, as shown, for example, in the US in January 2019, when a group of transphobic feminists held a panel against trans equality and rights under the title Concerns from the Left, at an event hosted by the conservative right-wing Heritage Foundation, which has a long history of opposing LGBTQ rights, feminism, and immigration. We could ask, what makes left-wing politics left if it's not the commitment to oppose hatred? Is it then only economical questions? Of course, these conjunctures do not come as a surprise, as we know. Socialists backing far-right queer and transphobic legislations and state racism, feminists joining right-wing anti-trans propaganda, or gay people reproducing Islamophobic ideas of emancipation, migrants turning against other migrants as the new unwelcome newcomers, etc. To give you an example from the UK context, I would like to discuss how so-called gender criticals maneuver their politics between loudly claiming not being far-right while mobilizing far-right agendas. Jacob Breslow convincingly demonstrated through a close reading of Maya Fostatter's Employment Tribunal appeal judgment that asserts the protection of a gender-critical belief under Section 10 Equality Act, that the outcome has been used as a way to intimidate scholars, research teams, and individuals who stand up against gender-critical beliefs. The judgment says that the claimant, I quote, beliefs is not comparable to Nazism, end of quote, and is therefore protected. This applies indeed to almost every utterance, as the judge explains, pointing out, I quote, the extremely limited circumstances in which a belief would be considered so beyond the pale that it does not qualify for protection at all, end of quote. To be honest, personally, I would want so much more for myself as a feminist than a judgment to attest my not being a Nazi. For example, I would not want my utterances being compared to gross homophobia as seen in paragraph 66 and 116, as also Breslow points out. The Fostatter judgment didn't say gender critical beliefs are never discrimination. It said most of the abhorrent things people say are not abhorrent enough for them to lose their jobs for saying them. And it would need to be determined if discrimination happened in any given case. In theory, this counterclaim to prove transphobic discrimination could be brought. But the question is, who carries the risk of not being recognized and seen by the law in a discrimination court case? As it happens, feminist legal scholarship has a long and controversially discussed history, for example, McKinnon, Crenshaw, Cooper, Buckley, and Renz, and others, of being suspicious of leaving the power of definition what is and what is not discrimination to the law without always questioning the limits of the law, using Spade's term here. With this, gender studies as a field builds on a double focus on struggles for rights and justice and a critical distance from certainties about what these are and who their subject can be, which makes epistemology central for my understanding of the field. All speech acts are performative and do something, even if they don't do what they say they do. Saying I'm not transphobic does not necessarily make you into not a transphobe. And even more, every gendered reading is a misreading. Misgendering a person based on your reading does not make the person into the gender you want them to be. performativity is not that simple, but makes you, in the best case, into a bad reader, and in the worst case, into a transphobe. And completely unrelated, saying I am not a Nazi does not make you into not a Nazi. It kind of depends who your friends are. There was Maya Forstater doing all this work of writing comments to Jacob's piece, stating the court asserted she's not anywhere near to Nazism. And boom, University of Austin dropped, featuring Forstater friend Kathleen Stock as faculty alongside an impressive lineup, including a masculinist, multimillionaire sponsor, a British Empire and Western civilization enthusiast, a white professor who is sulky about being called a racist, and two professors who believe biological difference makes males better at math than females. Wait, is this still not anywhere near to Nazism, or are we getting closer? I want to close with the question what intersectional feminist politics that thrive for social justice and radical social transformation can be in right-wing times. Clearly, in my last example, the judgment used Nazism as the line that cannot be crossed, which, given the fact that we're in the UK, raises the question, why it is Nazism that specific form of fascism, and not, for example, colonial genocide, that is the line that cannot be crossed? So yes, of course, transphobia might not be close to Nazism or colonialism, but its biological determinism borrows from far-right and colonial grammar. Right-wing times seem to allow people to attend far-right, racist and anti-immigration conferences, calling themselves left, and seem to allow people to close their eyes to the fact that anti-gender has been mobilized by the far-right nationalists and white supremacists across the globe to not only attack trans people, but also feminists, lesbians, queers, and trans people alike. My question would be, who do you align yourself with in right-wing times?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alyosxa, for that exceptionally precise connecting of anti-gender, far-right, and fascist movements, and for that exceptionally urgent question around solidarities and alliances. I think that that's really important for the conversation that we're having today and more widely. I'm now going to hand over to our final speaker of the evening, Fatima, and I'll remind everyone who's in the audience that after this, we're going to be opening up to a Q&A session in which you can use the Q&A box at the bottom to ask questions of the panelists. So start thinking of questions that you might have. But first, Fatima.
Thank you very much. I'll use my 10 minutes to make a few pretty broad statements, and I'm going to start out with a 70-year-old quote that probably many of you are familiar with. A civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. A civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. The fact is that the so-called European civilization, Western civilization, as it has been shaped by 2 centuries of bourgeois rule, is incapable of solving the 2 major problems to which its existence has given rise: the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. That Europe is unable to justify itself either before the bar of reason or before the bar of conscience, and that increasingly it takes refuge in hypocrisy, which is all the more odious because it is less and less likely to deceive. Europe is indefensible. So that was Mason there in his discourse on colonialism. And since then, Europe has done little to prove him wrong. On the contrary, the issues Césaire identified escalated in the decades since. Despite the formal end of colonialism, we remain stuck in a state of coloniality, and the fact remains Europe is indefensible. What Europe stands for today is a global order fundamentally built on a binary model that invariably and necessarily first creates a clear division between white Christian Europe and its others, denying the historical reality of intersection, exchange, and commonality, and second, associates Europe with worthiness and defines its others as unworthy, including unworthy of the very right to live, as we can see daily at and increasingly within the continent's border. Europe, not as a material space, not its inhabitants, not its thought conditions, but Europe as a concept needs to be destroyed to achieve decoloniality here and globally. Absent from the concerted rethinking and rewriting of European 20th century history after the end of the Cold War, which combined post-fascist and post-socialist narratives into a Western capitalist success story, was a third factor in dire need of reassessment: Europe's colonial legacy. The refusal to engage with this past as internal to Europe's history also shapes the continent's vision of its future, manifests in a steadily growing racialized population that remains un-European, and in futile attempts to once and for all define and fortify Europe's physical, political, and identitarian borders. Borders which are imagined to be self-evident, stable, and natural, but which are malleable, shifting, and largely imaginary, though very real nonetheless, and which are applied along the fault lines of race. Because of this key role of race in the construction of European identity, it is impossible to integrate racialized communities into the existing model of Europeanness. What is necessary instead is its further destabilization. And I believe that this destabilization is being achieved by the practices of European activists and artists of color, who can offer potential answers exactly because of the peculiar position in which continental structures of racialization put communities of color, not quite fitting either dominant models of Europeanness or of racialized groups in settler colonial states. This misfit, this displacement of European communities of color results in their marginalization, which in models of Europe as well as diaspora, but it also produces radical strategies of resistance, which I've summarized as the queering of ethnicity, which is not only practiced by queer people of color, but is always in line with the non-theological, creolized political strategy, working with the tension of the supposed incompatibility of being a European and of color, rather than trying to resolve it. And I'm working a lot with the idea of queer people of color, and I'm of course aware that both terms, while having their roots in resistant movements, have been co-opted to the point that there are reasonable demands for their dismissal as potential tools of transformation. But I still find them powerful when mobilized from the methodological viewpoint of queer of color critique, itself an interdisciplinary approach grounded in activist strategies. And I understand queer of color critique to mean, very briefly, a methodology that resurrects queer as a term of intersectional analysis, not merely synonymous with LGBTQ+, but referencing processes of constructing normative and non-normative behaviors and populations, recognizing that the interactions of race, class, sexuality, and gender creates more complicated groupings and hierarchies between and within communities than simple dichotomies suggest. Building up women of color feminism and its identification of culture as a site of resistance for multiply marginalized people, such as women and queers of color. Queer of color critique disrespects borders between theory and practice, activism and art, building Glissant's poetics of relation, or in Casey Cohen's terms, of politics or one's relation to power, and not some homogenized identity is privileged in determining one's political comrades. In the process, destabilizing naturalized understandings of time and space that work in the interests of particular groups, recovering impossible alternatives, in short, to rip off Audre Lorde, it is the way we help to give name to the nameless so it can be thought. But of course, more than 30 years after Lorde's poetry is not a luxury, queers of color remain the nameless in most movements and communities, even though, or maybe because, their work is often central to the survival of those movements and communities. The erasure of activists who often do the most exhausting, frustrating, less recognized work in movements and are expected to do this work because they still have to prove themselves is really down and trustworthy, is challenged by queer of color critique. To quote Grace Hong and Rod Ferguson, the mobilization of difference by women of color feminism and queer of color critique is intended not to erase the differentials of power, value, and social death within and among groups, as in a multiculturalism model, but to highlight such differentials and to attempt to do the vexed work of forging a coalitional politics through these differences, end quote. While multiculturalism constructs and fetishizes difference, women of color feminism and queer of color critique deconstruct neoliberal different but equal discourses that justify and maintain capitalist exploitation by not merely using but producing difference as a means to hide connections between, for example, the privatization of the permanent war in the global south and the militarization of civil society in the global north, resulting in the mass incarceration of people of color globally as normalized and profitable forms of population management. This approach allows to highlight the differentials of power produced by a European discourse of belonging that tends to pit sexual against racial minorities, thus both denying and exploiting the intersections between the two categories. Queerness becomes tolerable if it's perceived as being compatible with a neoliberal project that produces new forms of exclusions. And in the current European context, racialized others emerge as the group whose exclusion is necessary for the survival of the larger Western project of inclusive humanism. Oppositional coalitional politics are urgently needed in light of global coalitions between neoliberal, nationalist, and reactionary forces, but they need to be coalitional politics that see the struggle for queer rights as part of the larger movement for equality and liberation, a necessary part that cannot be excluded or postponed or ignored, which is a daunting task, but I believe that queer of color critique is a framework, and the queering of ethnicity as a counter strategy allows us to build and sustain coalitional politics that are both attentive to the intersecting structures of power that we all are fighting and to the different positions from which we do so, offering some preliminary tools for the theorizing of positionality, legibility, and identity beyond Eurocentric universalism and ethnic essentialism. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Fatima, for those amazing sets of reflections. I see we have one question in the Q&A chat thing that we can turn to. And I also have a few questions to pose back to the speakers. But if any of you would like to respond to something that's come up in the talk, in one another's talks, we can also begin there. I don't know if something sprung up to any of you as you were hearing your co-panelists speak. Otherwise, I can ask a question. I'll start with one question that I have, just thinking off of Fatima's call for coalitional politics. I was thinking about that in relationship, Abeera, to the work that you were doing at the end of your paper, which was thinking about the interdependent vulnerabilities as a starting place through which we could resist nationalist structures of violence and nationalist forms of antagonism that are specifically being mobilized through an allegedly queer politic toward antagonizing Muslim populations, towards producing the sort of other of the UK and the other of Europe. And I just wondered if you two might think together about that, or if others would want to think through these forms of Alyosxa also spoke to the importance of thinking about who you're working with, right? A different kind of coalition, perhaps, than the ones that the two, or certainly than the ones that the two of you are trying to articulate and think with. So maybe we could think about this question of interdependency around vulnerability, coalitional politics, allegiances, and maybe Richard, if you have something that's come through from your own research around the ways that the communities that you're researching also think through various forms of coalition or allegiance that helps them articulate a sort of diasporic queerness that might be useful. So maybe we go back to Abeera just to hear your thoughts around that thinking through.
Yeah, I can start off by, I guess, sharing what I've been thinking about recently in relation to my PhD project, which is basically kind of attempting to think about coalition in relation to queer Muslim subject formation without deifying a past queer / anti-racist politics that, you know, achieved some form of like perfection of coalition, and thinking about basically how in my research I found that kind of the coalition build, the queer coalition building, the anti-racist coalition building is not necessarily happening under the category of queer Muslim, or isn't necessarily happening by charities that claim, for example, to represent queer Muslims, etc. And I think like there are two ways of making sense of that. And one is kind of in the British landscape, the kind of neoliberal like degradation of identity, of organizing around identity politics, so that kind of the Thatcherite degradation of the welfare system has led kind of these like historic organizing, like POC, queer POC organizations to become service providers rather than kind of radical radical instigators, right? So they've kind of transformed this charity model, but also how I think that also creates a form of opportunity in that it kind of broadens our idea of like what can happen with identity politics. And I think, I think that in the contemporary landscape, the use of identity politics is in that coalition building rather than in that kind of neoliberal frame of these are the queer Muslim concerns, for example.
Alyosxa, Fatima, or Richard, want to come in on that question of coalition and how you see it working in or against the work that you're trying to do?
So today I spoke about the Russians, but I also sort of do research on Poland, and I think this the Poles, the Polish LGBT rights community is perhaps sort of a better example. Initially, they would establish sort of events that were specifically related to sort of sexual and gender minorities, but they were sort of attacked and criticized for sort of asking for special rights, for only thinking about themselves. And so there was a shift towards away from sort of LGBT marches to march for equality. And then they sort of brought in a much sort of broader coalition of sort of groups and individuals who were sort of marginalized and was marginalized by the state. So including sort of women, sort of ethnic minorities, disabled individuals. And this sort of proved to be a sort of a more successful strategy, not necessarily in the sense of gaining more rights or bringing about change, but it certainly sort of silenced a lot of the criticism that they were receiving, and it was just a sort of a way to sort of support each other in sort of individual struggles, and then sort of highlight the fact that they were sort of divined in opposition to the sort of the heteronormative, able-bodied, cisgendered norm, was a sort of a way to sort of shine a light on this construction of Polishness. And again, they were sort of constructed as being anti-Polish, un-Polish, sort of anti-Catholic. And so they would seek to sort of frame themselves as actually as we are as Polish as everybody else. So they would sort of use sort of national symbols in their sort of organizations, in their sort of pride marches. They would refer to sort of one of the equality marches, gave it a theme of sort of love thy neighbor, to sort of draw on the sort of the Catholic rhetoric. So there was various sort of strategies of sort of coalition building, sort of not only within the country, but also sort of long distance. Again, the benefit of various sort of diaspora communities sort of working sort of across borders in order to sort of challenge some of the sort of the control of the way that they are sort of represented in local media.
Makes me think a lot about, Alyosxa, your work on migratism and the ways that certain forms of nationalist production are tied to sort of trying an attempt to push back against a certain kind of racialized or migrantized positioning of certain communities as other to the nation, and that those always happen through sexual and gendered formations, that there's something about the sort of return to the nation, even for and specifically with diasporic communities, that functions in these quite ambivalent ways. I know that's been part of the work that you've done in the past.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like really central to think beyond the nation and to think community building as anti-nationalist, really. And so I'm saying this, as you say, Jacob, from a migrant perspective. And I think I'm very much influenced by the early work of Jasper Poir, who says there that crossing borders does not necessarily mean that you want to deconstruct borders. That could also mean that you want to reinforce borders. And also by Fatima's work in European Others, in which in which ethnicity gets mobilized as a concept that opposes nationalist identities. And I think that's really important. And I think that's also important looking at right-wing times, as I try to bring in, right, because the nation state, of course, gets re-established in many ways, in different contexts, in different ways, but they're also supranational, to use a whole term, Stuart Hall term, ways in which the nation state gets reinforced in certain forms of politics. And I think it's very important, like in homonationalism, to oppose the nationalism, but also in feminationalism, to use that term, to oppose the nationalism that some feminisms use. And I think there are two different realities for me here, right? There's one reality, that's the social media reality, in which we see all these kind of things going on clashes between different groups, for example. But then we see also the kind of community care, really, that we have, and that I think I rely on very much, right? In which people come together and they try to build intersectional politics for radical social transformation that goes across identities, but that is really based very much on the question is like, how can we have politics that doesn't throw others under the bus, right? And that definitely is something that can't be, that's not easy, right? Because you cannot, it's not easy to determine how you do that and how you overcome bias and so on, but it's like an ongoing work. And I think that is what's really giving me hope in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Fatima, do you want to just draw on that? And then we have two questions in the Q&A that I can turn to.
Sure. I mean, I very much agree with that. And I do think in some ways, of course, the last year or so has emphasized global connections. But on the other hand, I also think that it brought into focus the importance of localized work, the work of local mutual aid communities in response to state failure. Certainly where I am in the US, but I think that's also very much true for Europe. At the same time, I do think that the current pushback that we see both in nationalism, but also in these related forms, be it this whole discourse around Islamo-gauchism in France, or coming back to what you said in the very beginning, Jacob, in the German context, very explicitly solidarity for Palestine, vilified as a strategy to push back against a kind of solidarity across racialized communities that I do think has become a lot more visible in the last 10 years or so. So yeah, I mean, I can also totally agree with what Alyosxa said. The question of solidarity is one that is exhausting, that, you know, is a constant process. But even though I do feel pretty exhausted, I'm also hopeful, because I do think that there are signs of the persistence of this process. And I also agree with Abeera that this attempt to kind of look back to a glorified past of international solidarity is not very helpful. But at the same time, I'm also very invested in making accessible archives of the struggles that have taken place and that still often sustain us in ways that we're not even aware of.
Absolutely, it just makes me think of sort of connecting some of those that at this very same moment that you have people, as Alyosxa was saying, starting a sort of made up university for free speech, right, under this claim that they're being persecuted out of thinking, right, and persecuted out of speaking. Those people, as well as their allies, are also working to criminalize protest, right, and specifically calling for the protesters who are at LSE speaking in solidarity with Palestine, a solidarity that's also been articulated as a solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement, with a transnational thinking through various forms of injustice and occupation, right? But that the protest itself seen as the scene of violence, right, rather than the occupation itself. And so then there's a hypocritical moment of being told that one in power cannot speak, right, is being silenced while being platformed, at the same time as these radical movements are the ones that are being criminalized for their acts of speech. And having to think across these different moments. There's two questions in, now there's three questions in the Q&A. So I'll read them out and then we can try to take them as we go. So we have one from Gabriel Brew, who's a MSc Gender Sexuality student here at LSE. And this is for Professor Richard Mull. Fascinating talk. They're moving around. Fascinating talk, thank you. Was there among the participants a sense of longing for a progressive Russia they could eventually return to, right? So again, thinking around this question of the fantasy, perhaps, of a past or the fantasy of a nation. There's a question from Lola Olafemi, Sarah Leso, and Miriam Gauntlet. Following Fatima, we wondered if the panelists had any thoughts on how we as organizers and thinkers can anticipate and prepare for the destruction of Britain and Europe, and what possibilities await for queers so the nation state withers away. Quite a big, amazing question to think through. And then I'll read Ikena's question, and then we can come back. I see there's more that are coming up now. Ikena from LSE MSc Anthropology. Words like coalition politics and solidarity were spoken about as keywords connected to a queering the way forward against European nationalistic violence. It's interesting to hear about Black Lives Matter protests in Romania prompting conversations around violence against Roma as well as LGBTQ folks. How can transnational coalitions and solidarity be enacted in a way that effectively responds to the multiple violences being done by nations without diluting, especially while responding to the urgency of violence facing different populations? So why don't we start with Richard in terms of that question that Gabriel has asked, and then we might think about the question around what are the possibilities that await for queers when the nation state withers away, and finally Ikena's question around coalition. Okay, so Richard, let's start with you.
So the short answer was they weren't very optimistic. I mean, at the time I was doing the field work, at least there was an end date to Vladimir Putin's presidency. But since then, he had the laws and the constitution have been changed that he could sort of rule for as long as he likes. And so the general understanding was that nothing's going to change until Putin leaves. And as it now seems increasingly unlikely that he's going to leave anytime soon, the sort of optimism that things might change was sort of very limited. Nevertheless, they were all familiar with Russian history and that major changes can come about in Russian society. So there certainly was no dip in sort of enthusiasm for engaging in activism and trying to sort of improve the situation, but this idea that a more liberal Russia would emerge anytime soon was not something that was generally discussed, sadly.
Abeera or Fatima, do you want to take this question around how we as organizers and thinkers can anticipate and prepare for the destruction of Britain and Europe, and what possibilities await for queers? it's a straightforward question. You could probably answer it in a sentence or two, right? I think it's an amazing question, and one that I know will take some thinking and working on, but I'd be really curious to hear how you initially respond to it, or the ways that you see your own comrades working on it and thinking with it.
I think when I think of this question, I'm thinking of the opening quote that Fatima used in her talk, right? Europe is indefensible, but also Europe is made up of hypocrisy, right? I think that possibly we are already seeing the slow erosion of Europe in its own way, right? In terms of kind of the crisis of late capitalism, but I think that as the nation state withers away, it won't go down easily. And so networks of care are going to be essential for our survival, and the queers will have to think of themselves beyond just as the queers and learn from the mistakes that we've made in our contemporary moment in terms of exceptionalizing ourselves. So I think that I think that we will need to, Europe won't go down easily, as we've seen. And so I think that communities of care and stocking up on lots of resources is probably the way to go. Fatima, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I very much agree with you. The situation right now is not that Europe going down is any kind of wish or something like that. It's just a fact. It's going to happen, and it's going to take the rest of the world with it if we don't push back. And in some ways, maybe talking about the end of capitalism or the end of Europe seems like a hyperbole, but the point where capitalism embedded in this supposedly humanitarian, benevolent European structure of ordering the world will lead to a complete collapse is within our lifetime. So I do think that it's very urgent to think about structures that could offer an alternative to that. And I do think that the communities of care are very important, because there's so much constant pressure on us to fight externally against threats, that if we don't work on internal care for each other, what will happen is what very often happens, that is the people who most need this care, because it assures their survival, are also expected to do all of this work and are the ones who are scapegoated first. So I see, just for me personally, the most hopeful strategy in coalitions among communities of color, in ways to kind of create a sustainable connection that pushes back against this scapegoating that is always an easy solution. And this is something that I think that happens in different forms in different parts of the world. And the issue of Palestine, I think, is one that is, for many reasons, is such a lightning rod. But one of them is, I think, that around it, there are movements and discourses that actually connect all those issues around nationalism, racism, sexuality, which in turn is threatening for the existing system, but which also I think is a site of hope.
Yeah, it makes me think back to what you were saying around this question of state failure, Fatima. And we've certainly had our fair share of state failure here in the UK over this last year, if not multiple decades, right? And just thinking around the urgency of thinking through these questions of the fall or the collapse of a certain kind of mode of governance, particularly in relationship to pandemic and to global forms of care, and also in terms of the environment, in terms of the border, in terms of these projects of destruction that are sort of raging as we as we speak. But Alyosxa, I don't know if you wanted to either respond to that set of conversations or to Ekene's question around queering as a form of connecting BLM protests in Romania and thinking about these different forms of nationalism or of sort of transnational solidarity.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I tend to think of queering, and that's very much based on queer of color critique, as queering means disrupting normative orders, right? While transing, for example, could mean going beyond a category. So transnational could mean transing the national, going beyond the national. And I think that's exactly the question, that's an old transnational feminist question, which is still very much at the center of a lot of politics, right? Is the question between the local and the global that's raised here. And I think it is really important to see, for example, the Black Lives Matter protest that swept the globe in a way in 2020 as a tool that of course comes from the US, right? And the language that comes from the US is comprehensible, right? So like the term queer, for example. On the other hand, I think, so that's why it was adopted for anti-racist protests and many other sides, right? But I think what's also really important is to not fall into the trap to think of, for example, Romania or the Balkans as not having race, but having ethnicity instead, as Catherine Baker would, for example, put it. And to put race back into the region, right? And I think this is like really important to hold both things, right? To be aware of the fact that the language of Black Lives Matter might have come from the US, but actually what the protests have done across multiple sides is putting anti-Black racism on the agenda in Europe and like making it really central that Europe, of course, as Fatima has pointed out to us, is invested in whiteness, and anti-Black racism is a thing that is important in Europe, in all parts of Europe. And I think the Black Lives Matter protests really bridge that very well in saying anti-Black racism is important in Romania and it needs to be addressed because obviously there are Black people in Romania, and the myth that there are no Black people in Eastern Europe, of course, is not true. But at the same time, also then to say what other racisms are around here and are really like at the forefront of defining the nation. And in Romania, that's certainly anti-Romaism, that's certainly also anti-Semitism, looking at the history of the nation building process in Romania, right? And so then putting these things together as an intersectional agenda, I think that's really important for politics that work in the local, but that are connected to transnational, to going beyond the national, not to try to deconstruct also the local as part of the national and not fall into the trap of repeating their nationalist agendas.
Brilliant. I've got three more questions here to think through with, and so I'll read them out just for time's sake, and then we can see how we get on. One is from Vinya, from MA Gender Studies and Law at SOAS. Thank you for your thought-provoking contributions. The question is, how would you theorize the reinforcement of the concept of Europe and progress/development narratives within LGBT diaspora groups specifically, especially when they've experienced persecution, sought asylum from their home countries? So how is this question of migration, diaspora, and asylum taken on board in the conversations that we're having today about looking beyond Europe and outside of the border? And the other one is kind of similar, but is thinking, it's from Michael Round from BA Anthropology and Law at LSE, specifically asked towards Fatima, but we can expand out as well. How is the destruction of Europe to achieve decoloniality beneficial for post-colonial societies that have already internalized the message of queer sexualities as Western? How is it helpful beyond Europe, given that they were responsible through colonial practice for oppression elsewhere? The last or the third question here is about this, the framework of tolerance, the sort of tolerant and intolerant queer subjects, and how these are being mobilized within political discourse. How tolerance serves to stabilize the status quo, and how tolerable queers get mobilized for the aims of the state. So sort of three kinds of things, one around tolerance and tolerance, one around how the post-colonial figures into our conversation of Europe and Eurocentrism in relationship to sexuality. And then the first is thinking about questions of asylum and migration. Anybody want to start us off?
Sorry, go ahead. I don't really have any answers. I just wanted to say, in terms of the post-colonial, if we want to call it like that, I would say we use a term like coloniality, or going with Cedric Robinson, racial capitalism. That's a structure of power that has been implemented globally and is continued to be used globally. So this process of decolonization has to happen everywhere. And I just really think that there's a lot happening that goes beyond binary. The people might use the discourse of Europe or the West as the natural home and protector of human rights strategically, while at the same time being aware that they are not protected within a system that is fundamentally racist. I think there's it's already very clear that the effect of the climate crisis will be fortification of borders that will need to be justified by an enforcement of the idea that non-European lives and Black and brown lives are worthless compared to European lives. And that is something that affects the queer diaspora as much as any other group. And I do think that there's quite an awareness around that, as well as there's an awareness among queer activists in the global South, where you can simultaneously have a critique of the narrative of European superiority in terms of human rights, and a critique of the strategy of post-colonial governments claiming that issues of sexuality are always a Western thing imported into their culture, just as Europeans always claim that race is something that is imported from the US into their own culture, in which it doesn't really reflect. So I think I totally agree with what Abeera says earlier, that there is a process of destabilization that is already very visible, and that in some ways seems very threatening, but at the same time is also promising, because in order to actually not only have Europe collapse under the weight of its own failed policies, but rather to have it restructured in a larger context, this period of destabilization has to be embraced with as little fear as possible, because of course it's scary to go somewhere and not really knowing what the end point is, but that is actually the only way, I think, out of this binary construction that is so destructive.
Abeera, did you want to come in? I know you, yeah.
Yeah, I just had a quick point on the question of diaspora and how they deal with sexuality, I believe was the question. Diaspora, LGBT diaspora groups. And I think I think from my research, I realized that there's a difference between diaspora as a political, as what Aftar Bra has called the diaspora as a political practice, and then diaspora simply as seen as a conception of like a shared history of migration. As someone who is part of this like nebulous category of the South Asian diaspora, I've been witness to conservative and liberatory iterations of it in my experience of it as someone involved in diasporic communities. So I've been privy to queer South Asian spaces where people are defending Modi and, you know, defending the occupation of Kashmir, where, and I've also seen, you know, a iteration of kind of the trauma of migration from, you know, so-called Islamic countries being used to mobilize Islamophobic politics in Europe. And I think that is very much connected to a diasporic politics and cannot be untethered from diaspora. But I've also seen diaspora being a heuristic to mobilize anti-caste politics and to mobilize solidarity between Kashmir and Palestine, and a queer solidarity between Kashmir and Palestine. So diaspora, like any other political mobilization, is fraught with contradictions.
I think we have time for this one last question that's posed by Nat Raha, who very joyfully says, nearly free of all institutions, but still at St. Andrews. And Nat writes, while I love the optimism around the end of Europe, the links this panel have presented around fascism, state racism, and Islamophobia, homophobia, and transphobia clearly shows the alignment of power between far-right governments, media, and capital. And so I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on practices for dismantling these powers and their alignment, be they political, aesthetic, or otherwise. Again, another massive question to be thinking through. Does anybody want to dare to try to think through or speak to some of the ways that they've seen this dismantling take place, even if it's just in hope? If not, perhaps it's a thing for us to sit with as we go on and think through these questions some more. And I'm sure, Nat, I know we can't have participants join, but knowing you, I'm sure you have your own suggestions for how those would be. So perhaps the next stage would be to have these conversations more fully, and as well to incorporate a wider array of panelists who could be together to think through the difficulties of the coming together of nationalism, of the far right, of sexuality and gender, as the scholars today have so clearly presented, the urgency of thinking through these questions and the necessity for continued forms of epistemological and activist resistance to this coming together, in the hope that we might be able to see these forms of power shift, if not fall. So I think we're just about out of time there. So I want to say a massive thank you to Richard, Abeera, Fatima, and Alyosxa for their excellent contributions and thoughts this evening. A big thank you again to the European Institute and to the Department of Gender Studies for hosting this, as well as the LSE Public Events program. And thank you to everybody who's attended this. You can see on the slide, there's more information about the two different hosts here. And just a major thank you to everybody, and take care.